The sound of a whip cracking through the crisp morning air made Grace Foster flinch, but she stood her ground, her chin lifted in defiance despite the growing crowd that had gathered on Park City's Main Street to witness her humiliation. The year was 1876, and the mining boomtown nestled in the mountains of Utah Territory had never seen such a spectacle, the banker's daughter being publicly disowned and cast out. "You will marry Silas Wellington as arranged, or you will leave this house and this town with nothing but the clothes on your back," her father, Harold Foster, bellowed, his face crimson with rage as he gripped the buggy whip so tightly his knuckles turned white. Grace, 20 years old with auburn hair that refused to stay pinned beneath her bonnet and eyes the color of sage, shook her head. "I cannot marry a man who is 3 times my age simply because it would consolidate your mining interests, father. I would rather face the wilderness alone." Her mother wept silently on the porch of their grand house, the largest in Park City, a town built on silver mining fortunes and the backs of immigrants who toiled beneath the earth. The spectators murmured among themselves. Some looked on with pity, others with judgment, a few with secret admiration. "Then you are no longer my daughter," Harold declared, his voice carrying across the dusty street. "Leave Park City by sundown, and may God have mercy on your disobedient soul." The crowd parted as Grace walked away, her head held high despite the tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. She had nothing, no horse, no money, not even a change of clothes. But she had her dignity and her freedom, and as she walked toward the edge of town, she knew that was worth more than all the silver in her father's mines. She had reached the outskirts when she heard hoofbeats behind her. Turning, she saw a man approaching on horseback, a tall figure silhouetted against the sun, his broad shoulders and the Stetson on his head marking him as one of the cowboys who occasionally brought cattle through the high mountain valley. "Miss," he called out, slowing his chestnut mare alongside her, "I couldn't help but notice your predicament back there." Grace squared her shoulders. "I need no pity, sir." The man pushed his hat back, revealing sun-bronzed features and eyes as blue as a mountain lake. His face wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, too weathered, with a scar running along his jawline, but there was something compelling about his steady gaze. "Name's Zachary Hawkins," he said, "and I ain't offering pity. Just figured a lady shouldn't be walking these roads alone with night coming on." "I am no longer a lady, according to my father," Grace replied bitterly. "I am a disobedient daughter who refused to sell herself for business interests." Zachary studied her for a long moment, then extended his hand. "My ranch is a day's ride from here. I need someone who can cook and keep house. My last help moved on. It's honest work, if you're willing." Grace hesitated. She'd never worked a day in her life, and accepting a position from a strange man could be dangerous. But the alternative was worse: starvation, or perhaps being forced to work in one of the town's saloons. "Why would you help me?" she asked suspiciously. A small smile played across his lips. "Let's just say I understand what it means to choose your own path, even when others try to force you down theirs." He glanced back toward town. "They cast you out for refusing to obey them. With me, you can obey only your own heart." Something about those words, and the straightforward way he said them, made Grace reach for his outstretched hand. He pulled her up behind him on the horse, and she hesitantly placed her hands on his waist. "I should warn you, Mr. Hawkins," she said as they rode away from the only home she'd ever known. "I've never cooked anything more complicated than toast." His shoulders shook with silent laughter. "Then we'll both learn something new, Miss Foster." As they rode through the aspen-covered hills, Grace felt a curious mixture of terror and elation. She had lost everything: family, security, position, but for the first time in her life she was free. The journey to Zachary's ranch took longer than a day. They made camp as the sun set, and Grace sat awkwardly by the small fire he built, unsure of her place in this new arrangement. She watched as he efficiently tended to his horse before preparing a simple meal of beans and jerky. "I'm sorry it's not what you're used to," he said, handing her a tin plate. "I'm grateful for it," she replied honestly. "Though I should be the one cooking for you since that's what you've hired me to do." Zachary shrugged. "There'll be time enough for that. Tonight you rest. Tomorrow will come soon enough." As darkness fell, he gave her his bedroll and slept sitting up against his saddle, his rifle across his knees. Grace lay awake for hours, staring at the stars visible through the pine branches overhead, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake or the best decision of her life. By mid-morning the next day, they crested a rise, and Zachary reined his horse to a stop. Below them stretched a small valley, lush with spring grass, cradled by mountains. A creek wound through it like a silver ribbon, and beside it stood a substantial log house, a barn, and several corrals. A small herd of cattle grazed in the distance. "Silver Creek Ranch," Zachary said. "It ain't much compared to your father's mansion, but it's mine, free and clear." "It's beautiful," Grace breathed, genuinely impressed. The valley seemed like a hidden paradise compared to the dusty mining town she'd left behind. As they approached the house, a dog came bounding out to greet them, followed by an older man with a weathered face and a pronounced limp. "'Bout time you got back," the man called. "Was starting to think you'd fallen off a mountain." "Just got delayed," Zachary replied, dismounting and helping Grace down. "Hank, this is Miss Grace Foster. She's going to be helping with the house. Miss Foster, this is Hank Tillman, my foreman and the closest thing to family I've got." Hank's eyebrows shot up as he took in Grace's fine dress, now dusty from travel but clearly expensive. "Well, ain't you full of surprises, Zach?" He touched his hat respectfully to Grace. "Madam." Grace managed a smile, suddenly acutely aware of how out of place she was. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Tillman." "Just Hank, miss. Everyone around here keeps things simple." Zachary led her inside the house, which was larger than it had appeared from a distance. The main room had a stone fireplace and simple but solid furniture. It was clean but Spartan, clearly a man's house, without any of the feminine touches Grace had grown up with. "Your room's through there," Zachary said, pointing to a door. "Used to be my mother's sewing room. It ain't fancy, but it's private." Grace stepped into a small but pleasant room with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a window overlooking the creek. "It's perfect," she said, though her stomach tightened at the reality of her situation. She was truly alone now, dependent on the kindness of a man she barely knew. "I'll leave you to get settled," Zachary said, sounding almost as awkward as she felt. "There's a dress or two in that chest belonged to my mother before she passed. Might fit you better for ranch work than what you're wearing." Before she could thank him, he was gone. His boots echoing on the wooden floor, Grace sat on the bed, finally allowing herself to cry for the family she'd lost, for the uncertainty ahead, but also from relief that she had escaped a life sentence as Silas Wellington's trophy wife. That evening, determined to earn her keep, Grace attempted to prepare supper. She had watched the family cook often enough, but had never actually prepared a meal herself. The results were disastrous: beans burned to the bottom of the pot, biscuits hard as rocks, and coffee so strong it made Hank's eyes water when he took a sip. "I'm so sorry," she said, mortified. "I told Mr. Hawkins I couldn't cook." To her surprise, both men laughed, not unkindly. "Call me Zach," he said. "And don't worry about it. Nobody died, though those biscuits might make good ammunition if we ever run short." His gentle teasing eased her embarrassment. Hank showed her how to salvage some of the beans, and they managed to have a meal that, while not delicious, was at least edible. Over the next weeks, Grace threw herself into learning the skills she'd need. A neighboring rancher's wife, Martha Johnson, took pity on her and came by twice a week to teach her cooking and other household arts. Grace proved a quick study, determined to master these tasks that had always been done for her. Zach was patient with her mistakes, never making her feel incompetent. He worked from dawn until dusk with Hank and the two other ranch hands, only returning to the house for meals. Grace found herself looking forward to those times, planning what to cook that might bring a smile to his usually serious face. One evening in late June, after serving a beef stew that even Hank had praised, Grace sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and pink. Zach joined her, offering a cup of coffee. "You're doing well here," he said. "Better than I expected, to be honest." Grace smiled. "Better than I expected, too. I've never worked so hard in my life, but I've never felt so useful. Do you miss it, your old life?" She considered the question carefully. "I miss my mother, and some comforts, I suppose, but I don't miss feeling like property to be traded for business advantages." She glanced at him. "May I ask you something personal?" He nodded. "Why did you help me that day?" "You could have ridden past like everyone else." Zach was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he sighed. "I know what it's like to be forced into something against your will. My father was like yours, thought he owned me, could decide my future." He gestured toward the valley. "I was supposed to become a lawyer back east, family tradition. I chose this instead. He disowned you, something like that." His face closed off, and Grace sensed there was more to the story, but she didn't press. "Well, I'm glad you defied him," she said softly. "Otherwise, I'd probably be married to Silas Wellington by now, learning to be a proper banker's wife. Instead, you're burning biscuits and washing a cowboy's shirts," Zach said with a rare smile. "And I've never been happier," Grace replied, surprised to realize it was true. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Then Zach cleared his throat and stood. "Better turn in. Cattle don't care if we're tired come morning." As summer progressed, Grace settled into ranch life. She no longer needed Martha's help with cooking, and had even begun putting up preserves for the winter. The house had slowly transformed under her care, curtains at the windows, wildflowers in mason jars, quilts folded over chair backs. It was becoming a home rather than just a place to eat and sleep. She also began to notice Zach in ways that confused and thrilled her. The way sunlight caught in his dark hair when he removed his hat, how his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the gentleness in his hands when he worked with horses. One afternoon in August, Zach found her struggling to hang laundry on the line during a gusty day. "Here, let me help," he said, easily reaching to secure a sheet that had blown loose. "Thank you," Grace said, conscious of his nearness. "Though I should be able to manage laundry by now." "You manage just fine," he replied. "Better than fine. This place hasn't been so well cared for since my mother was alive." The compliment warmed her. "I've been meaning to ask what happened to your parents. My mother died of fever when I was 16. My father—" He hesitated. "He's still alive, far as I know. Back in Boston, running his law firm, probably still telling the story of his ungrateful son who threw away his education to become a savage." "You're hardly a savage," Grace said. Zach's laugh held no humor. "You should have heard him when I joined the Union Army instead of finishing law school. Called me every name you can imagine. When I came west after the war, instead of going home, he wrote me off completely." Grace was stunned. "You fought in the war between the states," he nodded. 4 years. Saw things no man should see." He unconsciously touched the scar on his jaw, Came out here to find peace afterward. And did you find peace? Most days, he said quietly. Some nights are still hard. Without thinking, Grace reached out and touched his arm. I'm sorry. His eyes darkened, and for a moment she thought he might pull her closer. Instead, he stepped back. Need to check on that new foal, he said abruptly and strode toward the barn. Grace watched him go, her hand still tingling where it had touched him. She was developing feelings for Zach, feelings that went beyond gratitude or friendship. But she had no idea if he felt the same, and she couldn't risk losing the safety and purpose she'd found here by revealing her heart too soon. In September, Zach announced he needed to go to Salt Lake City for supplies and to sell some cattle. Might be gone a week or more, he told Grace over breakfast. Hank and the boys will be here if you need anything. Grace nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. She'd grown used to seeing Zach every day, even if their interactions were often brief and practical. Would you like me to bring anything special back for you? He asked. The question surprised her. Some proper tea would be nice, she admitted, and perhaps some fabric if it's not too dear. My dress is nearly patched beyond repair. Make a list, he said. Anything you want. The morning he left, Grace stood on the porch watching him ride away with Hank and the small herd of cattle they were taking to market. The ranch felt emptier without Zach's quiet presence, and she threw herself into work to fill the void. 4 days after Zach's departure, Grace was kneading bread dough when she heard riders approaching. Looking out the window, she was shocked to see her father dismounting in front of the house, accompanied by Silas Wellington and 2 other men she didn't recognize. Her heart pounding, she wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch. "Father," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Harold Foster looked older than she remembered, his face more lined, but his eyes were as cold as ever. "So this is where you've been hiding," he said. "Living in sin with some cowboy, disgracing our family name even further." "I am employed here as a housekeeper," Grace replied, her cheeks burning. "There is nothing improper about my arrangement." Silas Wellington stepped forward, his thin lips curved in what he probably thought was a benevolent smile. At 58, with dyed black hair and a paunch that strained his expensive waistcoat, he represented everything Grace had fled from. "My dear," he said condescendingly, "your father has reconsidered his harsh position. We're here to bring you home where you belong." "And then we shall proceed with the wedding as planned," her father added. "Silas has been most understanding about your indiscretion." Grace felt ice spreading through her veins. "I am not going anywhere with you. I made my choice months ago." "You have no choice," her father snapped. "You're coming home if I have to drag you there myself." One of the men with them, who had the hard eyes of a hired gun, moved his hand to rest on his holstered pistol. Grace realized with horror that they fully intended to take her by force if necessary. "The lady said she ain't going." The voice came from behind the men. They turned to find the 2 ranch hands, Joe and Miguel, standing there with rifles in their hands. "This is none of your concern," Harold Foster blustered. "This is my daughter, and I have every right to know," Grace interrupted, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "You gave up any rights to me when you cast me out in front of the whole town. I am 20 years old, and I make my own decisions now." "This is absurd," Silas sputtered. "Foster, control your daughter." "I suggest you gentlemen get back on your horses," Joe said calmly, but his rifle remained steady. "Miss Grace stays if she wants to stay." There was a tense moment when Grace thought the hired gun might draw his weapon, but her father put a restraining hand on the man's arm. "This isn't over," Harold Foster said to Grace. "When your employer returns, we'll see what he has to say about harboring my runaway daughter." They mounted up and rode away, but Grace knew they'd be back. She spent a sleepless night wondering what would happen when Zach returned. Would he stand with her against her father, or would he decide she wasn't worth the trouble? She got her answer 3 days later when she heard horses in the yard and rushed outside to see Zach dismounting, his face grim. "I met your father in town," he said without preamble. "He had quite a tale to tell about me corrupting his innocent daughter." Grace's heart sank. "Zach, he held up a hand. "Let me finish. I told him that you were under my protection and that if he or that walking corpse he wants you to marry ever set foot on my land again, they'd regret it." Relief flooded through her. "You did?" "Of course I did." His eyes softened. "Did you think I'd hand you over to them?" "I didn't know," she admitted. "It would have been easier for you." "Easy isn't always right." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a package wrapped in brown paper. "Got you something in town." Inside was the most beautiful blue fabric Grace had ever seen, along with buttons, thread, and trim. "It's too much," she whispered, running her fingers over the soft wool. "Thought it matched your eyes," he said, then looked embarrassed at his own words. "I mean, seemed practical for winter. There's a dress pattern in there too." "Thank you," she said, clutching the package to her chest. "Not just for this, but for standing up to my father." "Your father's a fool," Zach said bluntly. "Any man who'd trade his daughter's happiness for business connections doesn't deserve to call himself a father." That night after supper, Zach asked Grace to join him on the porch. The evening was cool, autumn already turning the aspen leaves gold on the mountainsides. "Your father won't give up easily," Zach said. "Men like him aren't used to being defied." "I know," Grace sighed. "He's determined to have this alliance with Silas. The Wellington Bank could finance his expansion into new mining territories. There's something you should know." Zach seemed unusually nervous. "Your father offered me money to send you back. A lot of money." Grace felt as if she'd been slapped. "How much am I worth to him?" $5,000. She gasped. It was a fortune enough to buy prime cattle, new equipment, anything the ranch needed. "And you refused," she said softly. Zach looked at her directly. "I did, but not for the reasons you might think." "What do you mean?" He stood and paced the length of the porch before stopping in front of her. "I refused because I don't want you to leave, not ever, and not as my housekeeper." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Grace. I think I have since that first day when you stood up to your father with your chin in the air, looking like you'd take on the whole world if you had to." Grace couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. This was everything she'd secretly hoped for, but had been afraid to admit even to herself. "I know I'm not the kind of man you were raised to marry," he continued when she didn't respond. "I'm rough around the edges. I wake up sometimes still fighting a war that ended years ago. I can't offer you the life you had in Park City." "I don't want that life," she finally managed to say. "I want this one, with you." He took her hands in his expression still uncertain. "Are you sure? I'm asking you to be my wife, Grace, to build a life with me here. It won't be easy." "Nothing worth having ever is," she replied, echoing what he had taught her over these past months. His smile transformed his face, erasing the worry lines and making him look younger than she'd ever seen him. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle at first, then deepened as she responded, her arms going around his neck. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Zach rested his forehead against hers. "I should have done that months ago," Grace laughed, feeling lightheaded with happiness. "I wouldn't have been ready then. I needed to find out who I am first, who I could be outside my father's shadow." "And who are you?" he asked, his voice husky. "I'm a woman who knows her own mind," she said firmly. "Who can make biscuits that don't break teeth, mend a shirt, put up preserves for winter, and stand up to bullies. And I'm a woman who loves you, Zachary Hawkins." They were married 2 weeks later by a circuit-riding preacher who happened to be passing through. Martha Johnson and her husband stood as witnesses, along with Hank, Joe, and Miguel. Grace wore a dress she'd made from the blue fabric Zach had given her. It was nothing like the grand wedding her father had planned for her and Silas, with no elaborate cake or string quartet or champagne. But as she and Zach spoke their vows in front of the stone fireplace in the ranch house, with autumn sunlight streaming through the windows, Grace knew she'd never been happier. Their wedding night was a revelation. Grace had been raised with only the vaguest understanding of what happened between a man and a woman, gleaned from overheard conversations between married cousins. But Zach was patient and gentle, guiding her through her nervousness to discovery and ultimately pleasure she hadn't known was possible. "I was so afraid," she confessed afterward, lying in his arms. "Of what?" he asked, stroking her hair. "That I wouldn't know what to do. That I'd disappoint you." He kissed her forehead. "You could never disappoint me, Grace. We have our whole lives to learn each other." As winter approached, they settled into married life. Grace continued to run the household, but now with the authority of being the ranch's mistress rather than its housekeeper. Zach consulted her on decisions about the ranch, valuing her quick mind and fresh perspective. They were eating breakfast on a crisp November morning when they heard a commotion outside. Zach went to the door, his hand automatically checking for the pistol he kept nearby. "It's your father," he told Grace, his jaw tight, "and he's brought the sheriff from Park City." Grace's stomach dropped. What could he possibly want now? Let's find out. Zach's hand was warm on the small of her back as they stepped onto the porch together. Harold Foster sat stiffly on his horse, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Beside him was Sheriff Donovan, a man Grace had known all her life. "Mr. Hawkins," the sheriff said, touching the brim of his hat. "Mrs. Hawkins," he added, acknowledging Grace's changed status. "What brings you out our way, Sheriff?" Zach asked, his tone neutral but his stance protective. "Mr. Foster here has made some accusations," the sheriff said uncomfortably. "Says you've been holding his daughter against her will. Says there's been no proper marriage." Before Zach could respond, Grace stepped forward. "That's absolutely false, Sheriff Donovan, and my father knows it. I left Park City of my own free will after being publicly disowned. I've been working here legitimately, and Zachary and I were married by Reverend Matthews 2 weeks ago with 5 witnesses present." The sheriff looked relieved. "That's what I figured, but I had to investigate the complaint." He turned to Harold Foster. "You heard the lady, Foster. She's a married woman making her own choices. There's nothing more to be done here." Harold Foster's face contorted with anger. "This isn't over," he spat. "You've made powerful enemies, Hawkins. Men like Silas Wellington don't forget being humiliated. Threatening a man on his own property isn't wise," Zach replied evenly. "Now, I suggest you leave before I forget my manners." After they'd gone, Grace sagged against Zach. "Will he ever accept that I've chosen my own path?" "Some men can't bend," Zach said, holding her close. "They'd rather break, but he can't hurt us now." But Grace wasn't so sure. She knew her father, knew his pride and his capacity for holding grudges. And Silas Wellington had both money and influence throughout the territory. Her fears proved justified in December when Hank returned from town with troubling news. "Bank's calling in the loan on the east pasture," he told Zach grimly. "Giving us 30 days to pay in full." Zach's face darkened. "That loan isn't due for another year." Bank manager said circumstances changed, something about reassessing risk. "Wellington," Grace said quietly. "He owns controlling interest in that bank." "Reckon so," Hank agreed. "And that ain't all. Feed supplier in town won't extend credit anymore, said his arrangements have changed." Zach pounded his fist on the table. "They're trying to squeeze us out." He looked at Grace. "I'm sorry. This is because of me taking you away from them." "No," she said firmly. "This is because of their wounded pride and greed. Don't you dare blame yourself." Over the next weeks, the pressure mounted. The loan on the east pasture was only the beginning. Other suppliers in the region suddenly wouldn't do business with Silver Creek Ranch. A potential buyer for their spring calves mysteriously backed out of a verbal agreement. "They're trying to starve us out," Zach said one night as they lay in bed. "If we can't sell our cattle or get supplies, we can't survive." Grace propped herself up on one elbow. "Then we need to find a way around them. What about selling to buyers in other territories? Or directly to the army?" Zach considered this. "The army's always looking for beef. There's a fort about 3 days' ride from here. And for supplies, what about the trading post near the Ute Reservation? My father and Silas wouldn't have influence there." He pulled her down for a kiss. "Have I told you lately how brilliant you are?" Their plan worked for a time. Zach secured a contract with the army fort, and they began getting supplies from more distant sources. It cost more and required longer trips, but it kept the ranch operating. Then disaster struck in January. Grace woke in the night to the smell of smoke. "Zach!" she cried, shaking her husband awake. They rushed outside to find the barn engulfed in flames. The ranch hands were already trying to fight the fire, but it was too fierce. "The horses!" Grace screamed, starting toward the burning building, but Zach held her back. "Miguel and Joe already got them out," he shouted over the roar of the fire. "Stay here." By morning, the barn was a smoking ruin. They'd saved the horses and most of the equipment, but all their winter hay was gone. "This was no accident," Hank said grimly, pointing to tracks in the snow leading away from the ranch. "2 riders came and left during the night." Zach's face was like stone. "Wellington's hired guns." "We can't prove it," Grace said, though she had no doubt her husband was right. "I don't need proof," Zach replied, his voice dangerous. "I need to end this before someone gets killed." He rode out that afternoon, despite Grace's pleas to wait until they could formulate a plan. He returned after dark, his expression grim but satisfied. "What did you do?" Grace asked, afraid of the answer. "Had a conversation with Wellington," Zach said, removing his snow-covered coat. "Reminded him that men who play with fire sometimes get burned themselves." "You threatened him." "I gave him facts," Zach corrected. "Fact 1, I know he ordered the barn burned." Fact 2, his fancy house in Park City would burn just as easily. Fact 3, unlike him, I do the job myself, not hire it out. "Zach," Grace was horrified, "you could be arrested for threatening him, maybe, but he's smart enough to know I meant every word." He took her hands. "I had to do something, Grace. He won't stop otherwise. Men like Wellington only understand force." "And my father, did you threaten him too?" Zach's expression softened. "No. I told him you're happy and safe, and that he has a standing invitation to come see that for himself if he can put his pride aside." He smiled slightly. "Also mentioned that if he ever wants grandchildren, he might want to reconsider his position." Grace's hand went automatically to her stomach, which had just begun to show a slight roundness. They discovered the pregnancy the previous month and had been cautiously joyful, worried about bringing a child into their increasingly dangerous situation. "You told him about the baby?" she asked. "I did. Figured even Harold Foster might have a soft spot for his grandchild." The confrontation worked, at least partially. The direct attacks on the ranch stopped. The bank didn't rescind the loan demand, but no new obstacles appeared. They sold enough cattle to the army to pay it off, though it left their herd smaller than Zach would have liked. As winter gave way to spring, Grace's pregnancy progressed. Martha Johnson checked on her regularly and assured her everything was normal, but Grace couldn't help worrying. The nearest doctor was in Park City, and she couldn't imagine going there for help, not with the situation still so tense with her father and Silas. One afternoon in April, as Grace was hanging laundry, she spotted a buggy approaching. It was a fine vehicle, pulled by matched bays, the kind used by wealthy residents of Park City, not local ranchers. "Zach," she called, her heart racing. He emerged from the barn, saw the buggy, and immediately came to stand beside her, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. As the buggy drew closer, Grace gasped. "It's my mother." Eleanor Foster had aged a decade in the month since Grace had last seen her. Her once auburn hair, so like Grace's own, was now streaked with gray, and her face was lined with worry, but her eyes lit up when she saw her daughter. "Grace," she said as Zach helped her down from the buggy. "Oh, my dear girl." They embraced, Grace suddenly overwhelmed with emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel. "Mother, how did you find me? Does Father know you're here?" "Your father is the one who told me where you were," Eleanor said, surprising both Grace and Zach. He's had a change of heart of sorts." She handed Grace an envelope. Inside was a bank draft for $1,000 and a brief note in Harold Foster's precise handwriting, "For my grandchild." No strings attached. Grace couldn't believe it. "He actually wrote this," Eleanor nodded. "Your husband's visit affected him more than he let on. And then last month, Silas Wellington was caught in a compromising position with the widow Jensen. The scandal has been tremendous. Your father realized he'd nearly sold you into marriage with a man of no moral character whatsoever." She looked at Zach appraisingly. "He still believes you could have done better than a rancher, but he acknowledges that at least you chose an honorable man." Zach looked as stunned as Grace felt. "Mrs. Foster, would you care to come inside? Grace has made a fresh apple pie this morning." Over pie and coffee, Eleanor told them more. Silas Wellington had been exposed as having affairs with several women in Park City. His reputation was in tatters, and even his money couldn't repair the damage. Harold Foster had publicly rescinded any business arrangements with him. "Your father would never admit it," Eleanor confided, "but I think he's relieved you escaped that marriage. And—" she hesitated. "He misses you, Grace, in his own way." "He has a strange way of showing it," Grace replied, still struggling to reconcile this news with the man who had cast her out and then tried to destroy her new life. "Pride is a terrible master," her mother said softly. "Your father has been in its grip for too long. But seeing you now," she gestured to Grace's obvious pregnancy, "about to make us grandparents, he's beginning to realize what really matters." Eleanor stayed for 2 days, helping Grace prepare for the baby and mending the rift between them. When she left, she promised to return before the birth. "Your father may even come with me next time," she said, though she sounded uncertain. "He's welcome," Zach said, surprising Grace. "As long as he comes in peace." The baby arrived in early July, a healthy boy they named Samuel after Zach's father. Martha Johnson helped with the delivery, and both mother and child came through it well. When Samuel was 2 weeks old, Eleanor Foster returned to the ranch. This time, Harold Foster was with her. The meeting was awkward at first. Harold was stiff and formal, uncomfortable in the simple ranch house. But when Grace placed his grandson in his arms, his facade cracked. "He has your eyes," he said hoarsely. "The same eyes you had as a baby." "His name is Samuel," Grace told him. Harold nodded. "A strong name." He looked at Zach. "You've built something good here, Hawkins. I may have been wrong about you." It was as close to an apology as her father would ever come, but Grace knew what it had cost him to say even that much. "We named him after Zach's father," Grace said, "but his middle name is Harold." Her father's eyes widened in surprise, then filled with tears. He quickly blinked away. "Samuel Harold Hawkins," he said, testing the name. "A fine name for a fine boy." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Harold Foster made an unexpected offer. "I'd like to set up a trust for Samuel," he said, "and for any other children you might have. Nothing with strings attached, just a grandfather's provision for his grandchildren's future." Grace looked at Zach, uncertain. They had managed to recover from the winter's hardships, but the ranch's finances were still precarious. Such a trust would ensure their children would always have resources, no matter what happened. "That's generous," Zach said carefully. "But we want to raise our children to value work and self-reliance, not to expect handouts." Harold nodded. "I respect that. The trust would be structured to provide for education and emergencies, not idle living. They would still need to make their own way in the world." After further discussion, Zach and Grace accepted the offer, recognizing it for what it was, an olive branch and a chance to heal the family rift for the next generation's sake. As summer turned to fall, life at Silver Creek Ranch settled into a new rhythm with baby Samuel at its center. The tension with Park City gradually eased. Silas Wellington, his reputation permanently damaged, sold his interests in the bank and moved to San Francisco. Suppliers who had once refused to do business with the ranch now welcomed it. One crisp October evening, with the aspen leaves golden on the mountainsides and the first dusting of snow on the highest peaks, Zach found Grace on the porch after she'd put Samuel down for the night. "Hard to believe it's been more than a year since you came here," he said, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders and pulling her against him. "The best year of my life," she replied, leaning into his warmth. "Despite everything. Do you ever regret it, standing up to your father that day?" "Coming here with a stranger," Grace turned in his arms to face him. "Never, not for a single moment." She reached up to touch his face, tracing the scar along his jawline that she now knew by heart. "You told me to obey only my own heart, and my heart led me to you." Zach kissed her then, a kiss full of promise and memories and love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. Inside the house, their son slept peacefully. Outside, the stars emerged one by one above the valley that was their home. And Grace Foster Hawkins, once cast out for refusing to obey, knew she had found exactly where she belonged, not by following someone else's commands, but by having the courage to follow her own heart. 10 years passed, bringing changes to Silver Creek Ranch. The small log house had been expanded to accommodate the growing family. Samuel was now joined by his 9-year-old sister Alina, 7-year-old brother James, and 5-year-old twins Robert and Rose. The ranch had prospered, with more cattle, better horses, and additional hands to work the expanded property. Relations with Harold and Alina Foster had improved over the years. They visited regularly, and the grandchildren spent part of each summer in Park City, bringing laughter to the house that had once been so cold and formal. Grace, now 30, had grown into her role as the ranch's mistress with confidence. She managed the household accounts, directed the seasonal workers who helped with gardening and preserving, and even occasionally joined Zach on cattle drives when the children were visiting their grandparents. Zach, at 38, had a few more lines around his eyes and silver threading through his dark hair, but he remained strong and vital. The nightmares from the war had gradually diminished over the years, though they still occasionally surfaced during thunderstorms that reminded him of artillery fire. On the anniversary of the day Grace had first come to the ranch, they always spent the evening together on the porch, reminiscing about how far they'd come. "I still can't believe you offered me a job when I just admitted I couldn't even cook," Grace said, nestled against him as they watched the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson. Zach chuckled. Best decision I ever made, even if we did eat some terrible meals that first month. Not as terrible as the ones you made before I came, she teased. Hank told me all about your cooking. That traitor, Zach said without heat, but he wasn't wrong. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the creek and the distant lowing of cattle. From inside came the sounds of the children being herded to bed by Martha Johnson's daughter Rebecca, who helped with the household now that the family had grown so large. You ever think about what might have happened if you'd given in to your father that day? Zach asked. If you'd married Wellington, Grace shuddered. Sometimes. I would have been miserable, trapped in a gilded cage with a man who saw me as a possession. She turned to look at her husband. What about you? Do you ever regret picking up a stubborn, helpless banker's daughter with no practical skills? Never, he said, his blue eyes serious. You weren't helpless, Grace. You were brave. It takes courage to walk away from everything familiar to choose the unknown over comfortable certainty. I wasn't brave, she protested. I was desperate. Same thing sometimes, he replied, kissing her forehead. Besides, you've more than proven your worth around here. Don't think I haven't noticed how the ranch runs twice as efficiently since you took over the books. Grace smiled at the compliment. She had indeed discovered a talent for organization and figures that had helped them expand the ranch in smart, sustainable ways. We make a good team, she said. The best, he agreed. And we've raised some fine children. As if on cue, the door opened and young James appeared in his nightshirt. Papa, will you tell us a story? Rebecca said we could have one more if you weren't too busy. Zach grinned. Never too busy for a story. Which one do you want? The one about how you and Mama met? Chorused several voices from inside. Grace and Zach exchanged amused glances. It was the children's favorite tale, though they'd heard it countless times. Well, Zach said, following James inside with Grace behind him. It all started on a spring day in Park City when your mama decided she wasn't going to let anyone tell her what to do. The children were gathered in the large bedroom the boys shared, already in their nightclothes. Even Samuel, who at 10 considered himself nearly grown, listened eagerly as Zach recounted the tale of meeting Grace on the road out of Park City. And then what did you say, Papa? Alina asked, though she knew the answer by heart. I told her, Zach replied, his eyes meeting Grace's across the room, they cast you out for refusing to obey them. With me, you can obey only your own heart. And did she? Little Rose asked, her eyes wide. Grace stepped forward and took Zach's hand. I did, she said softly. And my heart led me right where I belonged. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Grace and Zach lay in bed, talking softly about plans for the coming year. They wanted to expand the orchard, perhaps build a proper schoolhouse for the ranch children and those from neighboring properties. I had a letter from my father yesterday, Zach said, running his fingers through Grace's hair, still auburn though with a few strands of silver now. He's coming to visit. Grace propped herself up on one elbow, surprised. Zach's relationship with his father, Samuel Hawkins, Sr., had been even more strained than Grace's with her parents. The elder Hawkins had reluctantly reconnected with his son 5 years earlier after suffering a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. Their correspondence had been cautious, the wounds of the past still tender. He's well enough to travel all the way from Boston, she asked. Apparently so. Says he wants to meet his grandchildren before he dies, though the old fox will probably outlive us all out of sheer stubbornness. There was affection mixed with the exasperation in Zach's voice. When will he arrive? Next month. He's taking the train as far as he can, then hiring a coach. Zach hesitated. Are you all right with this? Having him here, Grace smiled. Of course, he's family. She laid her head on his chest, listening to his steady heartbeat. Besides, if I've learned anything over the years, it's that it's never too late to heal old wounds. Look at my father, who would have thought he'd become such a doting grandfather. True enough, Zach agreed. Though I'm still not sure how I feel about him teaching Samuel to play poker. Better than him teaching our son to be a cold-hearted businessman, Grace pointed out. Harold Foster has mellowed considerably in his old age. The visit from Samuel Hawkins, S.R., proved to be a turning point. The distinguished Boston attorney, now in his 70s and walking with the aid of a cane, arrived with trunks full of books and presents for the grandchildren he'd never met. Initially stiff and formal, he gradually warmed as the children drew him out with their curiosity and exuberance. Young Samuel, named for him, was particularly fascinated by his grandfather's stories of courtroom dramas and famous cases. One evening, as Zach walked his father back to the guest room after a long day, the older man paused at a window overlooking the moonlit valley. "You've built something remarkable here, Zachary," he said quietly. "I was wrong to try to force you into my mold. You found your own way, and it was the right one for you." Zach was momentarily speechless. In all their cautious correspondence, his father had never directly acknowledged his error in trying to dictate his son's future. "Thank you, Father," he finally managed to say. "That means a great deal." The elder Hawkins nodded, his eyes still on the view. "I was too proud to admit it before, but I've always been proud of your service in the war. You fought for what you believed was right, regardless of the cost. That takes courage." "I learned that from you," Zach said. "You always taught me to stand by my principles." Samuel Hawkins, S.R., smiled wryly. "I suppose I did, though I was surprised when you applied the lesson to defying me." He turned to face his son fully. "Your mother would be proud of the man you've become and the family you've built. She always said you had to find your own way." That night, when Zach recounted the conversation to Grace, there were tears in his eyes. "All these years," he said, "I thought he'd never understand." "People can surprise you," Grace replied, thinking of her own father's transformation. "Sometimes they just need time to see what's truly important." Samuel Hawkins, S.R., extended his visit from the planned 2 weeks to over a month. By the time he left, he had established strong bonds with all his grandchildren and had even begun teaching young Samuel the rudiments of law, noting the boy's quick mind and logical thinking. "He might make a fine attorney someday if he chooses that path," the elder Hawkins told Zach and Grace before departing. "But whatever he and the others decide to do with their lives, I hope you'll let them follow their hearts as you did." "We wouldn't have it any other way," Grace assured him. Life continued its steady rhythm at Silver Creek Ranch. The seasons turned, the children grew, the ranch prospered. There were challenges, of course, drought years, harsh winters, illness, but they faced them together, their bond strengthened by everything they'd overcome. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Zach surprised Grace with a gift he'd been working on secretly for months. He blindfolded her and led her up the hill behind the ranch house. "Can I look now?" she asked impatiently. "Almost." She heard him open a door, then felt him guide her forward a few steps. "Now." He removed the blindfold and Grace gasped. They were standing in a small, perfect building with windows on all sides overlooking the valley. Inside was a desk, bookshelves, and a comfortable chair. "Your writing room," Zach said. "I've seen how you scribble in your journal every night trying to capture the day's events. Now you have a proper place to write." Grace turned to him, overwhelmed. "Zach, it's perfect. How did you know?" "I pay attention," he said simply. "And Martha might have mentioned that you've been talking about writing down the family story, our story, for the children to have someday." Grace had indeed been thinking of chronicling their journey, preserving the tale of how they'd found each other and built this life together against all odds. "There's more," Zach said, leading her to the desk where a package wrapped in brown paper sat waiting. Inside was a beautiful leather-bound journal with the Hawkins family chronicle embossed on the cover. "Oh, Zach," Grace whispered, running her fingers over the soft leather. "I thought you could start at the beginning," he said. "That day in Park City when a stubborn young woman refused to obey anyone but her own heart and changed both our lives forever." Grace wrapped her arms around him, her heart full. "I love you, Zachary Hawkins. More than I could ever write in any journal." "And I love you, Grace Hawkins," he replied, holding her close in the little writing room overlooking the home they'd built together. "More today than yesterday and less than tomorrow." That night, after the children were asleep, Grace sat at her new desk and opened the journal. The blank pages waited for her to fill them with their story, the story of a woman cast out for refusing to obey, and the cowboy who taught her that the only command worth following was the one that came from her own heart. She dipped her pen in ink and began to write. "It began on a spring morning in 1876, when I chose freedom over security, and found, in that choice, everything I never knew I wanted.